So about 6 years ago, I uploaded my first ever review on this channel on a neat little horror game that really took me by surprise, known simply as Outlast. And holy shit, apparently the YouTube algorithm decided to spam everyone and their mom with the video and give it a massive boost in views, starting in November of 2018. I wish I knew why, but much like God, YouTube works in mysterious ways. Outlast is my favorite kind of game, mixing survival horror, stealth, and action to create an unforgettable single-player experience. And the reason I started my channel was because I had these pent-up thoughts about games that I loved throughout my teenage years, but simply had no way to vent about my passions. So I bought Fraps, replayed Outlast, and decided I'd write a very rudimentary script talking about how scary it was, as well as attempting to be funny by screaming, a quality inspired by my deep love for early JonTron videos. While some people commented how funny some of the loud jokes were, many others noted that they found my voice enjoyable to listen to and thought the screaming portions were overkill. But it's interesting to see what I wanted my channel to be early on compared to how it is today. Since originally uploading the video, I've come to realize many of Outlast's faults, but repeat playthroughs have also subsequently made me more appreciative of its strengths. Also, it's funny how much more exuberance I had during my first dozen videos when I was 24. You can really hear the difference of how dead inside I sound now that I'm in my 30s. I haven't even changed my microphone or anything, I just became more impoverished and cynical in the years since.
Music changes into a terrifying backdrop and he immediately gives chase.
Outlast came out in late 2013 and received a story expansion in the form of DLC in mid-2014 called Outlast Whistleblower, which sold very well and, similar to the base game, was praised as a truly terrifying horror game. I won't be touching on the original game or the DLC in great depth, as the title of this video no doubt clues you into the fact that it's not the primary focus of this review, but I'll be cutting back to it as needed, as will soon become apparent. But a number of people were interested in me reviewing the DLC and sequel, so consider this that. Outlast 1 was a fun little thrill ride made by Red Barrels, in which you're an investigative journalist who decides to brazenly jump headfirst into a defunct insane asylum in order to expose a corrupt transnational company known as Murkoff, masquerading as a charitable organization. The story doesn't really matter too much, seeing as it revolves around a nightmare machine that can make human bodies generate nanomachines that make a nightmare cloud that can physically interact with people. And the plot is mostly there to serve as a reasonably compelling premise as to why your character is running terrified and defenseless from a bunch of leathery-looking inmates. Outlast has plenty of marketable design decisions. It has body horror, gore, action, stealth, and more importantly, jump scares that YouTubers use to overreact and get beaucoup bucks. Take something like Amnesia. It has an infinitely better story and moral overtones, but at the end of the day, it's very slow to start and often gets bogged down by the narrative, which, while excellent, puts people with ADHD like myself to sleep when we're just looking for a quick, cheap thrill. Outlast has essentially been designed with instant horror gratification as its modus operandi, which, while it doesn't make for an immaculate piece of media, it certainly makes for an easy sell to normies who just want to walk, run, open doors, and hear loud noises so they can go, "Oh my god, that was so fucking scary." It's made to be accessible to people who are terrible at horror games, because no matter how many times you die, you can simply restart immediately from a very close checkpoint, and you don't need to know how to operate any sort of weapon or use an intricate movement system to play a game and say, "That is a scary thing, I will now turn and run away from it." Obviously, that isn't a knock against Outlast. As I said previously, despite the game not being anything revolutionary or objectively remarkable, it's still a pretty memorable horror game. It's like the Fast and Furious of horror games, in the sense that not everyone wants to play a horror game that has a ton of downtime and overarching poetic themes. Most people just want a quick rush that they can complete in about 4 to 6 hours and say, "Wowee, that sure was startling." Whistleblower took a much more direct route, in which you're thrust into the action and pretty much running the majority of the time, with occasional but still nonetheless prominent stealth sections. The main story was pretty simple, as a software engineer known as Waylon Park decides to report unethical wrongdoing to a journalist that the player understands is miles upshire from the base game. But upon realizing he was caught by the Murkoff Corporation, and more specifically by corporate douche Jeremy Blair, is forcibly admitted as a test subject for the morphogenic engine program. The remainder of the DLC plays out in the same way as the base game, with Waylon running and occasionally hiding from a variety of abominations, as well as Chris Walker making several infrequent appearances, but most horrifying of all being the cannibal Frank Manera, whose presence is abruptly announced by the metallic whirring of his buzzsaw, letting the player know they should hide immediately. He prompts almost the entirety of the stealth sections compared to the psychopathically charming Eddie Gluskin, who slowly chases you around in a number of unavoidable scripted chase sequences that culminate in the semi-finale before the game is wrapped up. Blair is a charming character, if not just for the fact that he's a well-dressed and academically accomplished yuppie with a borderline hoarse, textured voice that makes him easy to hate, so it's a shame he isn't utilized to greater narrative effect, seeing as the player only sees him a total of 3 times before he dies. The timeline of Whistleblower was really interesting since it begins before the events of Outlast, but ends after the conclusion. So while Miles dies in the end of the first game, oh yeah, spoilers, Waylon ends up seeing him as the Wall Rider in the ending of the DLC. It's also a nice touch to see Father Martin's followers start a fire after burning him at the stake, only for you to later see the engulfed church from an outside perspective and immediately realize the scope of the timeline as it comes together. All in all, the first game and the DLC made for a really memorable experience that terrified the shit out of me and made for an unpredictable, ambiguous survival game that did what it set out to do extremely well, even if it made for a very simplistic and linear encounter compared to the countless other horror games on the market. Outlast 2 came out in early 2017, when I was in the middle of a move and trapped in a Texas hotel for several months. So while I couldn't make an actual video at the time, I ended up resorting to just making a Steam review 2 days after release, which upon revisiting it years later is apparently the most upvoted negative review on the entire Outlast 2 community hub on Steam, so that's pretty neat. I played it with high hopes and found myself extremely let down for a number of reasons I couldn't initially articulate, but after sleeping on it and comparing it to the first game, I realized what I didn't like about it. Keep in mind, I'm in the vast minority here if we're looking at the massive amount of support Outlast 2 got at release, as well as ever since. So I should be forthright in saying that I don't hate this game, just that it was a disappointment compared to what I was expecting when I first bought it on a whim. You can enjoy this game for any number of reasons, and I'm not here to try and convince you that you have bad taste or that this is an objectively indefensible game, just that I think it's an extremely inferior product compared to the original. If you like this game, that's totally valid, and despite this video being dedicated to deconstructing why I thought it was disappointing, I'll be reading comments and having discussions if you want to explain to me why you enjoyed it, so maybe you can broaden my horizons a bit. I'm not opposed to the idea that I'm being closed-minded about stuff I don't like. You start the game playing as Blake Langerman, a cameraman who's accompanied by his news reporter wife Lynn, as they cover the murder of a young pregnant girl before a blinding white light shuts down their helicopter and causes them to crash. As he wakes up, he finds himself in a flashback to his 4th grade Catholic school. He sees a locker open up, showing a picture of himself, Lynn, and his childhood friend Jessica posing for a picture. Immediately after, he follows a priest who disappears in a dark hallway, and upon the door slamming closed in his face, he turns around and sees Jessica before a wave of blood surges through the hallway and wakes him up from the weird nightmare world. Initially, I thought, okay, creepy balding priest in a creepy school following a screaming young girl who seems significant to the story. I think I know where this is going, but I don't want to jump to conclusions. Surely Red Barrels wouldn't take such an easy crack at the Catholic Church, I thought at the time. I mean, not to defend the Catholic Church, but I was kind of expecting something a little less on the nose. The game calls back to these segments extremely frequently, as if it has some big shocking revelation, but no, it's exactly what you think it is. And this will be spelled out in no uncertain terms by the end of the game.
Snap back to reality.
And Blake finds himself having woken up in a small village populated by a bunch of creepy Children of the Corn-esque hillbillies, who back away into the darkness the moment they see you. Before I understood how the game worked, this little detail absolutely made my skin crawl, as you can still see their glowing eyes fading into the darkness while they maintain eye contact. They only do this as soon as you zoom with your camera for closer inspection, making for a very unsettling first contact. One thing I liked about this section is how, as you're exploring this seemingly abandoned part of the village, you have a handful of inclines to run down, and much like real life, the more you run down the steep hill, the faster your acceleration increases. It also seemingly increases the more you sprint in general, and I'm a little disappointed they didn't utilize this for some effective scares, as it's difficult to make out what's happening directly in front of you at such a high running speed. The way I see it, a player has a certain amount of time to notice something before they can acknowledge what it is and whether it's benign or a legitimate threat to their safety. I would put the threshold of identifying the potential of a threat at about half a second. If the player is allowed allowed a longer period of time to assess the situation, and they realize it's a threat soon after, but it stands still, it's still creepy but lacks the potential to startle, since the player has had ample time to appraise the threat. But if the threat suddenly starts chasing you, or jumps at you suddenly before you've had sufficient time to recognize it, it becomes 10 times scarier. For example, I think Five Nights at Freddy's 3 in particular had a decent understanding of this concept, which I will amateurishly title the threat ascertainment principle. If you have a better name for this, or this concept already has a name, then please let me know in the comments section. But the point I'm trying to make is that I would have loved to see something take advantage of the short reaction time resulting from fast running in order to effectively scare the player once or twice. Blake soon encounters a pile of burnt children, a shocking image used to convey the premise that this village is a cult that is, for one reason or another, systematically murdering their young in an attempt to quash the potential uprising of the Antichrist, which the cult leader, Noth, believes is happening after hearing voices on the radio tell him as much. I think this is a great element to have in a horror game, and this is gonna sound really psychopathic, but bear with me. I like when media is bold enough to depict terrible things happening to children, because it's one of the few sacred cows left in entertainment. Whenever there's a little kid in a zombie movie, you know they're probably gonna be safe because people generally don't like seeing innocent children ripped apart in a bloody mess, which generally leads to advertisers saying, yeah, let's probably forego that option. So I always appreciate the dedication to a certain creative vision when an artist decides to depict something really disturbing despite knowing it will likely rub many more fragile players the wrong way. I'm particularly desensitized to violence in the media, having grown up playing Postal 2, Dead Space, Dead Rising, Resident Evil 2, Heart of Darkness, and all sorts of grim settings which have people dying in terribly bloody ways. So much like an addict, I require my video games to stoop to continuously lower lows so unexpected and atypical of this knee-jerk reactionary culture we live in, and show something really upsetting like cute animals being killed in order for me to actually feel offended and upset. I remember when Dead Island was announced and they made a trailer showing a dramatic slow-motion cinematic of a little girl being bitten by a zombie before turning and infecting her dad and being thrown out of a window, all played in reverse with sad piano music. It made me think, wow, this game is going to be really uncensored and unyielding in terms of mature content, and now that I'm finally an adult, I want to play really terribly offensive games. And then the game came out and it turns out they removed any child zombies in the game for a number of reasons, and I was a little let down. But anyway, to summarize, I like when big boy video games don't shy away from really messed up themes like that. So I encourage more edgy game studios to push the envelope further and further for horror junkies like myself that basically need someone to put a fucking gun to our head as we play in order to keep up that same level of adrenaline. As you play the game, Blake will encounter 3 separate factions: the Cultists, formerly known as the Testament of the New Ezekiel, the Heretics, and a tertiary group known as the Scald. The Cultists are led by the morbidly obese Noth. The Heretics are cave-dwelling opponents of the Cultists who want to bring about the birth of the Antichrist and are often dressed in tree branches and caked on mud. And the Scald are a splinter faction of the Cultists who live in the forest in a disease-ridden constant state of pain as a result of their untreated syphilis and gonorrhea resulting from unprotected sex with Noth and his followers, which Noth convinced them is a spiritual sickness of the soul. While I mentioned that Noth led the Cultists, the Heretics are led by a male-to-female transgender psychopath named Val, who seems intently focused on forcing herself on Blake, which probably is not the representation that the trans community wanted, but I suppose beggars can't be choosers. And the Scald are led by Laird Byron, a deformed dwarf who rides atop a large brute named Nick Tremblay. What is with these names? I'll come back to them later. Right after a word from our sponsor, WonderShare, who have asked me to tell you about their new product, DemoCreator. It's a minimalistic program that can capture screen recordings and webcam footage, while also doubling as an editing program. You can add files, captions, annotations, stickers, transitions, montages, and so much more. The interface is simple, while boasting surprisingly robust features. Check out the link in the video description and the pinned comment if you're interested in learning more. But without further ado, let's keep discussing this terrible game. In the first game, you had 2 different types of documents. Notes, which were taken by the player character after witnessing something remarkable and are viewed immediately at a glance, and documents, which were picked up throughout the asylum as physical objects, and also exist in an identical fashion in the sequel. But this time around, the notes are video recordings that Blake captures on his camcorder in complete silence, and only upon standing still and rewatching the exact video that he just recorded can the viewer understand why it was even remotely significant. And most of the time, Blake's commentary isn't even insightful.
Oh, fuck. There's gotta be some other way around.
Wow, thanks, Red Barrels. This sure is a good use of having a voiced protagonist. It's not like this was literally done better in the first game, and you just actually made it worse. Epic. On top of this, the handy little heads-up display that previously showed your total battery inventory at a glance has now been replaced with the admittedly cool system in which Blake has to physically glance down at his jacket pockets to see how many bandages and batteries he has on his person as they gleam back at him from the darkness. But accompanying this is a really condescending reminder of your current objective, narrated by Blake, desperately reminding himself out loud what he's currently working towards every single time you want to check your battery count.
Find Lynn. Nothing matters but Lynn. I can still find my way to the mine. The chapel's gotta be close.
This wouldn't be so annoying if it wasn't for the extreme linearity of the game design. Since there's basically only ever one direction to go, I think it would actually be more reasonable to just have a prompt saying, "Hey, keep going." While the first game took place in a claustrophobic insane asylum full of people who want to grab and stab you as you run and hide, the sequel takes place in a remote Arizona village in a very outdoor scenario with no walls or enclosed spaces, aside from a handful of isolated houses that usually contain a battery for your camera, a bandage with which to heal yourself, or a document to add context to the story, and one or two hiding places like a cabinet to hop into or a bed to crawl under. This means the stealth opportunities are severely hampered in favor of either laying down in the grass, which doesn't work most of the time, jumping into barrels, or hiding under beds, which also isn't terribly reliable. The enemies have an almost omniscient ability to tell where you've gone and corner you immediately, which makes the player feel like the game is rigged to beat them almost every time, suspending the belief that you have a chance to outsmart your opponents and replacing potential fear with the promise of frustration. Outlast 1 was clever because when you hid in a locker, the enemy would almost always check the locker directly next to you, and the first few times it happens, it always makes you feel like you escaped a close call with a vigilant murderer searching for you, until you realize it's intentionally scripted. But for those first few times, it's very nerve-wracking. In this game, the enemy is much more likely to just make a fucking beeline for wherever you are, and make you feel like hiding isn't even worth it. You remember in the first game when there was that intense scripted chase sequence that ended in the player climbing into the dumbwaiter and meeting the insanely homicidal Dr. Traeger? I hope you liked that bit, because there are exactly 14 more of them crammed into the game with no particular respect for pacing. The difference between the chases in the first and second game are pretty apparent, namely that when a chase happened, it was short and sweet before being padded out with a series of slower stealth sequences. But in this game, every time you encounter and escape a chase sequence, you can be sure there's one literally right around the corner, and as soon as it ends, you don't get a definitive idea that you've escaped, just that you've delayed the inevitable, before you're bombarded with loud music and lights, letting you know, okay, it's time for you to run again, just keep going until the music stops. The nightmare sequences alluded to earlier are quite possibly the worst thing. A lot of people cite them as the best parts of the game, and while I completely understand their reasoning, I fundamentally disagree. Sure, it's inherently creepier and more unsettling to be locked in an abandoned Catholic school than it is walking around an open, hazy forest at night, but mechanically the nightmare stages are just walking around until you notice the thing the game wants you to in order to advance the plot and get back to the real world, while occasionally encountering the priest's demon thing that either chases you for a set distance and then disappears when you've run far enough, or chases you into a corner and kills you if you don't realize the correct path you're supposed to take. I think I would have felt a lot more interested if there was more of a threat to the school area, like if the demon thing patrolled around the school like the first variant you encounter in Outlast 1. I'd probably shit myself several times per section, but for the most part, it's all 100% scripted. The Outlast series does extended stealth segments better than it does rapid-fire chase sequences, so hopefully once they begin production on Outlast Trials or Outlast 3 or whatever their next mainline game is, they'll learn from this game's faults and tweak the pacing accordingly. The rules of Outlast 1 were never outright spelled out for the player, as doing so would completely spoil the surprise. Good horror is quiet, secretive, and foremost, unknown. If you tell the player, this monster's pathing works like this, it will attack you under these circumstances, then you've shown your hand. We're not afraid of the dark because the darkness is inherently threatening, but because of the dangers that could be lurking beneath the veil of blackness, due largely in part to the fact that what our imaginations can conjure up is often much more disturbing than the reality of what could actually harm us. In the remake of Resident Evil 1 for the GameCube, there was a new mechanic introduced referred to as Crimson Head zombies, in which simply killing a zombie wasn't enough to dispatch the threat for good. Failure to destroy the head or burn the corpse would result in the zombie developing a flushed crimson hue to their skin, and the next time you encounter it, it will either be lying on the ground waiting to be activated by approaching it, or it'll be active in the room and immediately begin chasing the player. I remember watching a video interview between a reporter and one of the developers of the new Resident Evil 2 remaster. I looked everywhere elsewhere and I can't seem to find it now that the game is out and there's an abundance of post-release interviews, but it had a nice moment in which the interviewer asked how Crimson Heads work in the Resident Evil 1 remake, and the developer simply smiled and said, "I think it's scarier not knowing. Even after looking at resources online, the best answer I could find is that Crimson Heads take between 20 to 60 minutes to transform, but I'll never forget how terrified I was to see this lifeless red body spring to life the moment you run past it in order to get a crucial item with which to progress the story, and I'd bet money that it was a pulse-pounding moment for many other new players as well." After one or two playthroughs, Outlast makes it pretty clear what the limitations of the enemy AI are and how exploitable they can be. But for almost all players, the first time they play, they're going to be really drawn in by the scripted sequences and treat them like believable threats that behave intelligently instead of a dopey AI monster with bad pathing who attempt to slowly and inefficiently murder anything in front of them. In that first instance, you're up against a mysterious threat that can perceivably do any number of things to you, and that player expectation is as high as you let it get. When I see a threat in a horror game, if it's convincingly intelligent and unpredictable enough, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt that it can do literally anything to scare me until proven otherwise. Lack of clarity works against Outlast 2 in a number of ways, as it's unclear how damage works. In the first game, you could take multiple hits from enemies consistently, including from Chris Walker, who has a chance to simply grab you and stare into your eyes before throwing you and allowing you the chance to flee. Almost every time you encounter Marta, she one-hit kills the player, and on one occasion when she pulled me out from a hiding place and threw me, she did an immediate follow-up attack that I simply couldn't get away from. And when I was exploring the mines and evading the heretics, I opened a door to see an enemy who apparently shanked me before I had a chance to close the door and flee, despite being at max health when he killed me with a single blow. That said, considering the enemy pathing in the first game was limited to chasing you in and out of rooms, opening and closing doors, and occasionally ramming them down, I was impressed once I realized that enemies could crawl into small alcoves and pursue you during chases. A lot of the time you'd get outside of their zone and they'd simply turn around and leave, making them feel non-committal and lazy. So I think it would be cool to really show them chasing you as tenaciously as possible, since I'm always impressed to see enemy AI that knows when you're insulting them only to react in a realistic way that lets the player know they underestimated their pursuer. My least favorite detail from Outlast 2 is the fact that it's outside. This had tons of potential, and I was really interested in the concept of an outdoor, first-person perspective horror game with lots of areas to get lost in, but unfortunately I was entirely right about that. The only sections I can say are well done in the game are the cornfield as Blake gets chased by Knott's followers, the mines where you're claustrophobically stalked by the Scald, and any more populated areas with houses and windows, and otherwise a number of hiding places to give the player options regarding their escape. Outlast 1 had a few hidden rules that didn't necessarily take away fear from the player, but simply removed the surprise. In the first stealth segment, in which the player has to trip the circuit breaker to restore power to the asylum, there's a hostile enemy waiting behind a door to the third and final switch, who only makes his appearance known once the player pulls the first switch, and he breaks down the door before immediately making a beeline in the direction of the switch that was just pulled, meaning the player should pull a switch, hide, and then continue once the coast is clear. This interaction is fairly well scripted without feeling scripted, as the final switch is located down a long bent hallway, and the enemy NPCs don't give off any audio cues, making the likelihood that the player will run into them quite high. And for players who don't realize they're programmed to walk towards the nearest triggered switch, they're likely to experience a mini heart attack as they find themselves cornered with an aggressive variant, as they struggle to make it back to the entrance without taking damage. In Outlast 1, the expectation was that the player didn't want to get caught by a variant, because then the enemy and music would startle them, and they'd have to run and pray they could hide without the enemy seeing them. But all of that build-up and anticipation is stripped away the moment the player is told, "You can't avoid being caught, you've already been caught, now you just have to run until the enemy goes away," which I think is a suboptimal way to conduct the majority of the game's encounters, compared to giving the player the illusion that they have the opportunity to reach their goal without being found. The entirety of the Traeger encounter is the highlight of the game for many, primarily due to the fact that you constantly have to come out of your hiding place and look around corners with blind spots in order to advance. The first time I played, I had no idea where these hallways or doors would lead me, just that I had to poke and prod my way around the unfamiliar medical wing until I found a way out. And the odds of running into the insane doctor was incredibly high, meaning I had to ration the limited number of doors I could use to break his line of sight and get away safely. So there was a very palpable pressure to figure out where I needed to go and fast, all while keeping tabs on where Traeger might be lurking, knowing he could turn the corner at any moment and start charismatically slicing me. This goes double for Frank Monera, whom the player encounters several times in unfamiliar spaces, with the need to push forward as he aggressively pursues you with only a handful of doors to stall him, before your only option is to kite him around the more open areas and hope you're clever enough enough to piece together where the exit is located before he separates you from your better half. The chases in Outlast 2 were decently handled for the most part, guiding players with decent visual cues and light sources, but the problem is that they're inferior when injected in bulk with nothing to space out the pacing in between. The game shines brilliantly during the stealth sections, because there's a threat of being caught and the tension comes from trying to remain undetected, only to be startled when the enemy finds you and the scary music resumes. You get caught, you run, you hide, you wait, you try again. When the game forces you into one chase after another, you never get the time to decompress and reflect on the close call you just encountered, and it goes from thrilling to tiring. There's a reason why in Metal Gear Solid 3, you don't fight the bosses in rapid succession and then do all the stealthy bits after. They're spaced out in order to ration the momentum of the action. Outlast 2's stealth sections are undeniably the best part, most notably when you're running from the ogre-mounted dwarf mentioned earlier. Previously, when you ran from enemies, you had the chance to reach up and lock the door behind you to stall the enemy as they attempt to bash it open, which makes enemies from the first game kind of hilarious to think about when you realize they were just breaking down a completely unlocked door. And it's even a nice touch that they let you freely move underneath the bed and turn and look around, which is a nice change of pace from the first game, in which you crawl under the bed and were locked into place like some shitty prefab Unity game with a bunch of rigid canned animations. But once you get to the stealth sections with Laird and Nick, the game throws you a nice curveball. Instead of the usual 5 hits before the door opens, Nick bashes down the door like it's made of straw. That let me know that this giant dude was a terrifying force to be reckoned with, and I should maintain my distance at all costs. So it's a shame that shortly after this you end up watching them fall to their death, especially since the earlier encounters were just attempting to run and being killed with a flaming crossbow bolt almost immediately, and running from a distance as he shoots you from across a ravine. I kinda wish he became this game's version of Chris Walker, who chased you through 95% of the game before being superseded by the Wall Rider for the finale, as I never really found Marta very scary with her gravely biblical mumblings. The one time she truly terrified me was when she was attempting to stop you from pushing a wagon and climbing over a gate, as there were no clear hiding points, and she would aggressively pursue you around every corner, mostly because you had to force yourself into a very vulnerable open position before she ambushes you twice, as the cart slowly pushes forward. But every other time you encounter her, she just kinda wanders around with her smoker's voice quoting from her altered Noth Bible about murder and God's love and whatever other contrived shit she memorized. Compare this to Chris Walker, as he heavily breathes through grit teeth and stomps around the room with chains clanking together, with an occasional low-pitched tuba sting indicating his looming presence, and it immediately becomes apparent which is the more intimidating enemy to evade. Obviously, you can't just copy and paste an identical antagonist in the sequel and expect it to make sense, but I would thoroughly argue that a heavy, psychotic enemy is more intimidating than an overzealous, frail witch, even if she can kill you with a pickaxe. Samuel LaFlamme, who scored the original game and the DLC, reprised his role as the composer for the sequel, but I wasn't as impressed with his performance this time around. Chris Walker's theme had no tempo and gave the stealth sections an air of unpredictability and immediate tension. Compare this to Marta's music, which initially has a terrifying audio sting that occurs when you encounter her, and then transitions into a relatively unsettling breakneck track with a bunch of shrieking female vocals overlaying the signature "You are being pursued right now" tuba notes. But I think it works against the fact that Marta's signature spooky factor is her Bible quotes, which are made more difficult to hear thanks to the piercing music, which isn't as effective compared to Chris Walker's bestial breathing being quite audible over the minimalistic soundtrack. The rest of the soundtrack is by no means low quality, and there are plenty of tracks that have a nice texture to them, but in comparison to the first game's blaring orchestral scope that had plenty of wind and brass sections, LaFlamme opted to go a more ambient route for Outlast 2, involving a lot of vaguely dissonant synthetic sounds and shrieks. This may have been an intentional directorial decision to more closely match the more spaciously ambiguous outdoor areas, in direct contrast with the first game's claustrophobic linear environments. But unfortunately for the end product, we just get a lot of audio that's borderline unnoticeable, which renders the majority of the soundtrack unremarkable and forgettable. Some of it has remnants of what made the first game's soundtrack so eerie, but somehow managed to take away that same intimidating quality. For example, the track Choir Crescendo No. 4 Long begins with a compilation of female wails that rapidly builds in intensity as it scales higher and higher in pitch. But something about the excessive reverb makes it sound like you happen to be passing by a particularly active witch bonfire at that time of night, rather than encountering something that might be an immediate threat. But in the first game, there's this great moment where you enter the building for the first time, and suddenly you hear the song Swarm Ambience, which starts with a single, intimately clear female voice holding a note, which is soon multiplied tenfold over the course of 2 minutes, building and building as the track progresses. Both of these were done similarly, but only one of them was really done effectively. I also noticed a lot of recycled audio content, which I'm positive was done in the first game, but it was extremely noticeable in this one. For example,
God doesn't love you, not like I do. God doesn't love you, not like I do.
the game ends with Blake finding Lynn deep inside the caverns with the heretics, and as they try to get to a safe place for Lynn to give birth to her baby, they once again encounter Marta, who corners them. And just as she's going to murder Blake, a stray object pierces her through the chest and kills her.
Fuck you! And fuck your god!
As they head back to a nearby church, Lynn graphically gives birth to a baby as Blake grabs it and shows it to her, to which she replies,
There's nothing there.
before immediately dying. I don't know about you, but I felt absolutely nothing as Lynn died because they didn't bother to characterize her in the slightest throughout the whole game, effectively making her a damsel in distress with a bit of attitude.
Swear to fucking Christ, the first person who touches me loses their eyes!
Blake passes out and wakes up to Noth appearing for the second time in the game, and he explains to Blake that his child is the Antichrist and he's powerless to stop it, before slitting his throat and bleeding out. Blake wanders through a village full of the murdered cultists, and he looks up to see the sun exploding as he flashes back to a memory of a young Jessica with noose marks around her neck as she asks him to sit down and pray with him. The camera dips to black, and the credits begin to roll. Yep. That was the end. And despite the first game not having the most satisfying note to end on, this was an absolute atrocity of an ending. Very few questions were answered, the game made it apparent that there was nothing interesting to Jessica's story, and the plot from beginning to end was an incoherent, poorly paced mess that attempted to capitalize on the original game by making it bigger and busier with no clear vision on what the game would gain by being so erratic. Whether you like Outlast, the DLC, or the sequel more, I think we can all agree that even the worst Outlast game is still a pretty damn good horror game. Was I disappointed in the final result of what we got? Absolutely. Do I think the next Outlast game will improve upon a lot of the odd design choices found in Outlast 2? Certainly. The first game came during a time when I was sure horror had gotten about as good as it could have, save for the cancellation of PT, which, judging from the atmosphere alone, seemed to have the potential to rock the genre at its very core. I have no doubt this critique video is going to be bombarded with the usual responses of nitpicking, which seems to be the blanket strategy for many internet denizens who think my criticism is unwarranted and excessively petty, but don't care to put forth the effort to elaborate as to why exactly it's a nitpick, instead of a glaring gameplay flaw. And I take a lot of enjoyment in reading comments as to why people disagree with me. I'm not a game designer, far from it. I'm just a 30-year-old dude who's been playing games my entire life, and I know what I do and don't like, but every now and again I'll read a very well thought out comment someone leaves retorting the points I make in my videos, and it'll give me a lot of design thoughts to chew on. So if you feel like I've misrepresented the game and potentially overlooked some finer details that make the game redeemable, I encourage you to leave a lengthy comment to elaborate on any mistakes I might have made. At the time of this writing, Red Barrels hasn't clarified what the next game, Outlast Trials, is going to be about, nor have they shown any footage outside of the cinematic trailer. But I have a weird sinking suspicion that they're going to go the Dead by Daylight or Resident Evil Resistance route of social horror games with potential microtransactions. But regardless of the route they take, I know that when Outlast 3 does eventually come out, I'll be one of the first to preload the game and record some footage in anticipation of a review. But for now, that's all I have to say about the Outlast series until we eventually get another game. So, in the meantime, take care.